The ocean. Promise. The wind moved gently across the shoreline, carrying the salty smell of the ocean. Waves crashed softly against the rocks, creating a rhythm that calmed the hearts of those who listened. On this quiet human colony world, far from the crowded stars, a man named Ethan Cole walked alone after finishing his daily maintenance work. He lived a simple life, repairing broken solar panels, fixing leaking water systems, and cleaning abandoned research stations. The ocean was his escape. It was where he could think, breathe, and feel alive. Every evening, when the sky turned orange and pink, Ethan would take the same path down to the water. He would sit on a smooth rock, watch the sun fall slowly into the sea, and let the waves tell their endless stories. But this evening, something was different. As he walked down the sandy path, he saw a strange figure ahead, a small floating chair with glowing lights, hovering above the ground near the cliffs. In that chair sat Liora, a young alien girl with silver-blue skin and bright violet eyes. Liora was unlike anyone Ethan had seen before. She wore a soft white cloak that shimmered faintly in the fading sunlight. Her delicate hands rested quietly on the chair's sides, and her legs were wrapped in strange metallic bands that looked more like royal ornaments than medical devices. Everyone in the colony knew her as the Paralyzed alien girl. She had arrived months ago with an alien delegation from the distant Veyari Empire. Her condition was spoken of with pity. Some said she was born unable to walk. Others whispered she was cursed. Ethan had seen her before, always near the cliffs, always watching the ocean in silence. She never joined the other alien visitors who came and went. She never laughed, never cried, never asked for help. She only stared at the sea as if it held something she desperately needed. That evening, Ethan slowed his steps and stopped a few meters away. He didn't want to disturb her, but something in her expression pulled him closer. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon with such intensity that it made his chest tighten. She looked like someone standing on the edge of a choice they couldn't make. "Beautiful view, isn't it?" Ethan said softly, not expecting a reply. For a moment, there was only the sound of the waves. Then Leora's voice, fragile like wind through glass, answered. Yes, it was the first word he had ever heard her speak. He gave a small smile and sat on a rock near her, not too close, not too far. He talked a little about his work, about how humans used to build cities near oceans, about how children played in the sand and made little castles. She listened without looking at him. Her hands tightened slightly on the chair's arms whenever he mentioned the ocean. Ethan started to notice small things. The way her eyes followed the waves, how her breathing changed when the wind carried the spray of salt water near her. She wasn't just watching the sea, she was longing for it. It was a quiet, powerful longing that he couldn't ignore. As days passed, Ethan began greeting her every evening. At first, she only nodded. Then, slowly, she started giving short replies. Sometimes one word, sometimes two, but every time, her voice became a little stronger. He told her stories about Earth's oceans, about deep trenches where strange creatures glowed like stars, about surfers who rode waves taller than buildings. Her eyes would widen slightly, as if a spark was awakening inside her. One night, a violent storm rolled over the colony. Heavy rain fell, lightning split the sky, and strong winds shook the structures near the coast. Most people stayed inside their shelters, but Ethan couldn't rest. He had a strange feeling. He grabbed his raincoat and ran toward the cliffs. His boots splashed through muddy water as he hurried down the familiar path. Through the sheets of rain, he saw a faint light near the cliff edge. It was Leora's chair. Hovering unsteadily as the storm winds pushed against it, she was out there, alone, staring at the furious ocean. Her hair whipped wildly in the wind. Her cloak was soaked. She looked fragile, but her eyes burned with something fierce. Liora. Ethan shouted over the thunder. "You need to go back. It's dangerous." She didn't move. Her gaze remained locked on the stormy waves below. The ocean roared like a living beast. Lightning flashed, and for a brief moment, Ethan saw tears on her cheeks. She whispered something, so soft that the wind almost stole it. He moved closer, gripping a wet rock for balance. "I must see it," she whispered again, louder this time. "Not from here, but there." And she pointed toward the wild water below. Ethan froze. In her voice there wasn't fear. There was determination. It was the first time he saw her truly alive. Her trembling hands were not from weakness but from holding something back, something deep and personal. He didn't know why, but in that moment, a quiet promise formed inside him. If she wanted to see the ocean up close, he would find a way. He didn't care if she was alien or human, royal or ordinary. He didn't care about what the others whispered as he led her chair slowly back toward safety that night. His mind kept replaying her words. Not from here, but there. He looked at the raging sea one last time before closing the shelter door. He didn't know it yet, but this promise would take him on a journey across dangerous lands, uncover ancient secrets, and awaken something powerful that neither he nor Liora could imagine. The ocean was calling, and Ethan had answered, the silent girl's past. The days after the storm carried a quiet tension in the air. The skies were clear again, and the ocean sparkled under the sun as if nothing had happened. But something had changed between Ethan and Liora. She didn't speak much, yet her eyes were different now. The wall of silence around her seemed thinner, like cracked glass waiting for one more touch to shatter completely. Ethan continued his daily work around the colony, fixing damaged equipment, climbing dusty towers to adjust energy collectors, and cleaning broken filtration lines. But every evening his steps carried him back to the cliffs where she always waited. Her chair hovered silently in its usual place, her cloak neatly folded, her violet eyes staring at the endless horizon. She never asked him to sit with her, but she never pushed him away either. They began to share that space like two travelers who didn't need many words to understand each other. Ethan had grown curious. He didn't want to be rude or push into something painful, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that Liora was more than what she seemed. She didn't behave like someone who was helpless. Her eyes were sharp, scanning every wave, every cloud formation, every movement of the wind. Sometimes he caught her watching human engineers work from a distance, silently memorizing their actions. It was like she was constantly observing, learning, storing everything inside. There was intelligence in her silence. A quiet storm behind those calm eyes. He started asking small questions, gentle ones, about her people, her home, and her journey to the colony. At first, she stayed silent or gave simple one-word answers, but slowly, as the days passed, fragments of her story began to emerge like shells hidden beneath the sand. She spoke about the Veyari Empire, a vast alien civilization that stretched across dozens of star systems. Their worlds were filled with towering crystal cities, silent, floating temples, and disciplined citizens who obeyed ancient codes. The Empire valued strength, control, and tradition above everything else. Those who didn't fit the ideal were hidden away, forgotten like shadows cast behind bright walls. Liora belonged to the royal line of Veyari, something that stunned Ethan when he first heard it. She was not just any visitor. She was the heir of the Azure Crest, a bloodline tied to the oldest legends of her people. Her ancestors were said to command the tides of planets, to speak to oceans as if they were living beings. Ethan listened carefully as she spoke, her voice steady but distant, as if each memory carried both pride and pain. Her paralysis, she said, began when she was very young. Her legs lost all movement, and the imperial physicians declared her condition untreatable. But Ethan noticed something strange in the way she described it. She never said she was sick. She never said she was weak. She only repeated that, "They decided I would never walk again." It wasn't her belief, it was someone else's decision forced upon her life. Her presence on the colony was part of a quiet arrangement between the Veyari Empire and the Human Colony Council. She had been sent away from the royal palace to live in a peaceful place where she wouldn't be involved in political struggles. To outsiders, it was explained as sending her somewhere calm for medical care. But Ethan could feel there was more, something unspoken. One evening, as the sun melted into the water, Ethan gently asked her why she always stared at the ocean with such longing. Her chair turned slightly, and for the first time, she looked at him directly. Her eyes shimmered with a mixture of sadness and fire. "Because," she said slowly, "the ocean doesn't lie." Her words hit him harder than he expected. She explained that on her homeworld, the oceans were sacred. They were said to reflect the truth of one's soul. When she was taken from her palace and placed into a life of silence, the only thing she held on to were the legends of the sea. She believed that if she could stand before the ocean once again, not from a distance but close enough to feel its pulse, something inside her would awaken, something the Empire had buried. Ethan didn't fully understand the ancient beliefs of her people, but he understood what it meant to want to reclaim something taken from you. He could see that behind her calm surface was a deep ache, not just for movement, but for freedom, identity, and truth. The more he listened, the more he realized that Liora's story was tangled with secrets bigger than her wheelchair. She wasn't a fragile princess locked away for pity. She was a quiet storm being kept at bay. Ethan also began to notice the alien caretakers who occasionally came to check on her. They always maintained a polite but distant attitude. Their uniforms were clean and sharp, their movements rehearsed, and their eyes avoided direct conversation. Whenever Ethan approached while they were around, they would lower their voices or cut the conversation short. They treated Liora with respect, but it wasn't warmth. It was more like how soldiers treat a dangerous relic. Carefully, never casually. It made him uneasy, and it deepened his suspicion that her paralysis was not the full story. Late one night, Ethan passed near the alien embassy on his way home, and he overheard two Ve'ari guards talking softly in their language. His translator implant picked up fragments: seal, forbidden, return when ready, and not a cripple, a key. The words sent chills through his spine. He didn't know exactly what they meant, but it confirmed what his instincts had been screaming. Liora's condition was not a simple illness. It was something else, something the Empire was deliberately controlling. When he saw her the next day, sitting in her usual spot near the cliffs, watching the water, he felt a new sense of determination growing inside him. She wasn't just a girl who wanted to see the ocean. She was a princess with a locked destiny. And perhaps without knowing it, he was becoming part of that story. As the breeze brushed against them and the sun painted the sky gold, Ethan made a silent promise in his heart. He would help her reach the ocean not just for a view, but for the truth that waited within it. What he didn't realize was that his decision would soon place him between the power of a galactic empire and the awakening of something ancient. The journey begins. Ethan spent several sleepless nights thinking about Liora's words and the stormy night when she pointed toward the ocean. Something inside him had shifted. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't curiosity anymore. It was resolve. He had seen the fire in her eyes, the determination beneath her quiet surface, and he knew deep down that she deserved more than a distant view of the waves from a hovering chair on the cliffs. He didn't fully understand the politics of the Ve'ari Empire, or the secrets surrounding her paralysis, but he understood promises. A man who fixed broken things for a living had now found something far more important to fix. A dream. Early one morning, before the sun rose, Ethan walked into the old storage hangar at the edge of the colony. Dust covered everything like a thin blanket of time. Inside were scraps of old hover sleds, cargo carriers, and half-broken exploration vehicles left behind by survey teams years ago. He rolled up his sleeves and began working. His hands moved with precision and quiet determination. He welded frames, reconnected power cells, replaced old magnetic stabilizers, and reinforced the sled with straps strong enough to carry both a passenger and supplies across rough terrain. Hours passed, sweat ran down his forehead, but his focus didn't break. By the time the sun climbed high in the sky, a new kind of machine stood ready. Simple, strong and built with purpose. When he met Liora that evening, she was in her usual spot near the cliffs, watching the water as if it held the answers to questions no one else could hear. Ethan parked the hoversled nearby, its stabilizers humming softly. She turned her head slightly, curiosity flashing across her eyes. "What is that?" she asked, her voice calm but with a faint note of wonder. Ethan smiled and patted the sled. "This," he said, "is how we're going to get you to the ocean." Her eyes widened for a brief second, and then they softened into something that looked almost like hope. The alien caretakers were not pleased. When Ethan explained his plan, they reacted with alarm. They warned him about the dangerous terrain between the colony and the ocean cliffs, the shifting sand fields, the unpredictable energy storms that sometimes passed through the region, and the old abandoned structures that had collapsed over time. But Ethan stood firm. His voice didn't rise, but it carried a weight that made them pause. "She wants to see the ocean," he said, "and I gave her my word." The caretakers exchanged uneasy glances, and although they didn't openly approve, they didn't stop him either. Perhaps they believed the journey would fail on its own. Perhaps they underestimated the human standing before them. The next morning, as the first light touched the horizon, Ethan arrived with the sled and a pack of supplies. Liora was waiting. Her cloak was wrapped tightly around her shoulders, and for the first time since he had met her, there was a quiet readiness in her expression. She allowed him to carefully transfer her from the hoverchair onto the sled. The metallic bands on her legs glimmered faintly under the sunlight. He secured the straps gently, making sure she was comfortable, and then started the sled with a low hum. Slowly, the machine lifted from the ground and began moving forward. Their path took them away from the safety of the colony's walls and into the open wilderness. The terrain was uneven, filled with jagged rock formations, sand plains that shifted like liquid, and patches of old construction ruins from when the colony was first built. The air was cooler here, and the scent of the distant sea grew stronger with every passing hour. Liora sat quietly, watching everything with sharp, observant eyes. Her silence wasn't emptiness anymore, it was focus. She seemed to be memorizing every step of their journey, every change in the landscape, every gust of wind as they traveled. Ethan began to talk, not out of necessity, but to fill the long stretches of silence with warmth. He told her about the time he almost fell into a water tank while fixing a filtration pipe, about the children who used to build sand towers near the colony's shoreline, and about how humans long ago explored dangerous frontiers simply because their hearts couldn't rest otherwise. Liora listened intently. Her lips sometimes curved in the faintest smile, a fragile thing that made the endless journey feel lighter. The farther they went, the more challenging the path became. In one section, they had to cross through a shifting sand valley. The sand here moved like slow waves, swallowing anything that stayed too still. Ethan adjusted the sled's power, increasing the hover height to avoid sinking, but a sudden gust of hot wind slammed into them, pushing the sled sideways. For a moment, they teetered dangerously. Ethan gritted his teeth and held the controls tight. Liora's hand reached out instinctively. Grabbing the sled's side, her eyes glowed faintly, and the air around them seemed to stabilize. The sled stopped shaking. Ethan didn't say anything, but he noticed the strange energy that surrounded her hand before it faded. They reached an abandoned observation station by late afternoon. It stood like a broken skeleton against the sky, its walls cracked, its lights long dead. Ethan decided to rest here for the night. He set up a small campfire using old thermal rods, the orange light flickering against the ruins. Liora sat beside the sled, her gaze fixed on the distant dark line of the ocean far ahead. The sound of the wind through the ruined walls created a haunting melody. Ethan handed her a container of warm broth, and to his quiet surprise, she accepted it without hesitation. As they sat together in the dim light, Ethan noticed something subtle. When she thought he wasn't looking, Liora extended her hand toward the night sky and whispered in her language. The air shimmered slightly around her fingers. Like water rippling under invisible touch, he didn't interrupt, but he understood something important. This journey meant more to her than she had ever said. He looked at the stars above, then at the path ahead, and he knew they were stepping into something far bigger than a simple trip to the ocean. That night, as Ethan lay awake listening to the soft hum of the sled's resting engine, he thought about the empire that had kept her hidden, the whispered words he overheard from the guards, and the fire in her eyes when she looked at the sea. He didn't know what waited at the end of this journey, but he knew one thing clearly. He would not turn back. Not now, not ever. Whispers of power. The night at the abandoned observation station was colder than the nights in the colony. The wind carried a sharp bite, slipping through the broken walls like invisible fingers. Ethan had wrapped himself in a thermal blanket near the campfire, but sleep did not come easily. The silence of the wilderness was different from the hum of machines in the colony. It felt alive, as if the land itself was listening. The sled rested quietly a few meters away, its lights dimmed to conserve power. Liora sat near the edge of the ruins, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the distant shimmer of the ocean barely visible beneath the starry sky. Ethan watched her for a while. She had barely spoken since they left the colony, but she didn't look afraid. She looked focused, like someone walking toward a destiny only she could see. The faint light of the stars reflected on her silver-blue skin, giving her an almost ethereal presence. Her hands rested loosely on her knees, but every now and then her fingers twitched slightly, as if something inside her was moving, something that did not belong to the calm surface she showed. As the night deepened, Ethan began to drift between waking and sleep, and that was when he noticed it. A faint glow surrounded Leora's body, soft at first, like moonlight sliding across water. The air around her started to shimmer, bending faintly as if it was made of liquid glass. Her hands slowly lifted, her eyes half closed, and she began to speak in her language, the words flowing like a quiet song. The sand around her chair shifted, forming tiny ripples that moved in perfect rhythm with her voice. The broken metal beams nearby vibrated softly, echoing her chant like distant chimes in the wind. Ethan stayed completely still. His heart pounded in his chest. He had seen strange technologies before, alien machines that used light and sound in ways humans could barely understand. But this was different. There were no devices around her. No panels, no wires, no power cells. The energy was coming from her, and the wilderness was answering. He saw her eyes flicker open for a moment, glowing faintly with a deep violet light. She looked toward the direction of the ocean as if speaking to something beyond human comprehension. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the glow faded, the air returned to normal, and Liora lowered her hands slowly. Her breathing was steady, her expression calm. As if nothing unusual had happened, Ethan waited for a moment before pretending to adjust his blanket and lie back down. He didn't want to confront her with questions just yet, because deep inside, he understood that this wasn't the right time. What he had witnessed was not weakness, it was power carefully held in silence. The next morning, the sun rose in a pale orange light, painting the ruins with warmth. Ethan packed their things while Liora sat quietly on the sled. Her eyes seemed a little distant, but she didn't look tired. He considered telling her what he saw, but when their eyes met, she gave a small, knowing look, not defensive, not fearful, but as if she was silently saying, "You saw what you were meant to see." They continued their journey without words, letting the wind and the hum of the sled fill the air. As they moved further toward the ocean, the terrain became harsher. The ground turned rocky and uneven, massive stone ridges rising like frozen waves carved by ancient winds. Ethan navigated carefully, adjusting the sled's balance with every sharp turn. Liora kept her gaze forward, her hands resting on the straps. Her calmness during these dangerous stretches surprised him. It was as if she knew the path long before they reached it. Around midday, they passed through a canyon of black stone, its walls towering high above them. The place was eerily silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Ethan felt a strange uneasiness crawling along his spine. His instincts told him they were being watched, and when he glanced at Liora, he saw the same tension reflected in her eyes. She turned her head slightly, scanning the shadows with the precision of someone trained to sense hidden things. Unbeknownst to them, far above the canyon walls, a small imperial scout drone hovered silently, Its smooth surface reflected the sunlight like a shard of glass. The Vayari Empire had noticed their absence, and silent machines were now tracing their path, recording every movement. Waiting for the right moment to report, by late afternoon, they reached a plateau that offered a breathtaking view. From here, they could see the ocean more clearly. Stretching like a silver-blue mirror under the wide sky, Liora's eyes widened slightly, the first open emotion she had shown in days. Her hands gripped the sled's edges gently. She whispered a single word in her language, soft but filled with weight. Ethan didn't understand the meaning, but he understood the feeling. It was reverence, longing, and determination woven together. They decided to camp again on the plateau before making the final approach to the ocean cliffs the next day. Ethan set up the fire as usual, but his mind kept returning to what he had seen the night before: the glowing hands, the shimmering air, the way her voice made the sand move. This wasn't some harmless ability, it was ancient and powerful, and he began to realize why the Empire might have chosen to keep her away from the galaxy's eyes. As darkness fell, he finally decided to speak. "Liora," he said quietly while stirring the fire. "Last night I saw something." She didn't answer, but her gaze remained steady on the flames. Ethan continued, "Whatever it is you're carrying inside you, it's not something to fear." For a moment he thought she would stay silent, but then she whispered, "I'm not afraid of it, Ethan. I am afraid of what it will do when the ocean answers." Her words hung in the cold air like a distant thunder. She looked at the horizon where the ocean met the stars. Her eyes glowing faintly in the firelight. Ethan didn't fully understand, but he knew one thing with certainty. They were approaching something monumental, something that would not only reveal who she truly was, but also shake the quiet balance of everything around them. That night, the whispers of power moved silently through the air once again, not loud, not visible, but felt in the beating of the earth beneath them and in the stillness of the wind that listened closely. The edge of the ocean. The morning came with a sky that looked almost too calm. The wind moved softly across the plateau, carrying the faint sound of waves crashing somewhere far below. Ethan stood beside the sled, tightening the straps and checking the power cells one last time. The journey had already taken more out of them than either admitted. His arms ached from hours of maneuvering through rough terrain, and Liora's usually still expression now carried traces of quiet exhaustion. But neither of them spoke about turning back. They both knew that the end of the journey was finally in sight. The ocean wasn't just a distant glimmer anymore. It was a living presence waiting beyond the final ridge. As they set off, the landscape began to change. The rocky ground flattened into wide stretches of smooth stone that reflected the sun like polished glass. The air smelled stronger here, rich with salt and hidden energy. The closer they got, the more Liora's posture changed, her back straightened, her hands rested calmly on her knees, and her violet eyes were fixed firmly on the horizon. She didn't look like a fragile girl in a sled anymore. She looked like someone returning to something sacred. Ethan felt the same weight. The sound of the waves grew louder, no longer carried faintly by the wind but roaring steadily like a heartbeat that filled the sky. He could almost taste the sea on his lips, and with every passing moment, his curiosity about what waited at the shore deepened. He remembered the night he found her in the storm, whispering, "Not from here, but there." And now they were almost there. It wasn't an easy path. The smooth stone suddenly gave way to narrow, winding ledges that curled downward toward the ocean cliffs. Jagged rocks rose like the spines of sleeping beasts, and powerful winds rushed upward from the sea below. The sled trembled slightly as Ethan guided it carefully along the ledges. Liora remained calm, her gaze unwavering. Her silence was no longer heavy like it had been when they first met. It was alive, filled with purpose and strength. Ethan focused on the path, but part of his mind stayed aware of her presence behind him, the quiet power that seemed to radiate from her more strongly the closer they came to the water. After hours of careful descent, they finally reached a wide natural platform that opened directly toward the ocean. The sight that met them was overwhelming. The sea stretched endlessly under the bright sky, its surface glittering like liquid stars. Massive waves rolled in slow, powerful rhythms. colliding against the cliffs and sending sprays of water high into the air. The sound surrounded them completely, not as background noise but as something alive, deep and ancient. Ethan stopped the sled and took a slow breath. He had seen oceans on Earth before, but this was different. This ocean felt aware, as if it was watching them just as they were watching it. Liora's reaction was unlike anything he had seen before. Her eyes widened, glowing faintly in the sunlight. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from a deep, rising emotion that seemed to pour out of her chest like a tide finally breaking its walls. She whispered something in her language, a single word, repeated twice. It carried a weight that made the air seem to pause. Ethan didn't understand the meaning, but he felt its power. He slowly turned the sled so she could face the ocean fully, and she leaned forward, her cloak fluttering in the wind. But before they could take another step, a deep humming filled the air. It was mechanical, sharp, and completely out of place in the natural rhythm of the sea. Ethan's head snapped upward and his stomach turned cold. Imperial ships were descending through the clouds above the cliffs. Sleek, silver vessels with the Veyari crest glowing on their sides. They moved in formation, their engines creating a vibrating hum that shook the stone beneath their feet. Liora's eyes darkened, not with surprise but with grim recognition. She whispered, "They have come." Ethan felt the weight of the situation settle over him like a stone. He had known that their disappearance wouldn't go unnoticed forever, but part of him had hoped they would have more time. The ships hovered in the air, casting long shadows across the cliff. Then, from one of the ships, a group of Imperial soldiers emerged. Descending on anti-gravity platforms, their silver armor gleamed. Their movements were perfectly synchronized, and their presence carried the cold authority of the Empire. They landed on the platform with mechanical precision, their leader stepping forward. His voice echoed through a translation device as he spoke. "Human, you are interfering with Imperial matters," he said. "The girl is the property of the Veyari royal house. You will surrender her immediately." Ethan's jaw tightened. He had expected confrontation, but hearing them call her property made something hot rise inside him. He stepped in front of the sled, his stance firm. "She's not property," he said, his voice low but clear against the roaring waves. "She deserves to see the ocean. And I gave her my word." The soldiers raised their weapons, not to fire, but to intimidate. Their leader's expression didn't change. "You don't understand, human. This is not your place," he said, but Ethan didn't move. He could feel the wind tearing at his clothes, the sound of the waves behind him, and the silent presence of Liora at his back. He wasn't a soldier, he wasn't a hero, but in that moment he became a wall, standing between her and an empire. Liora's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Enough," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried something far deeper. The soldiers froze slightly, not because of volume, but because of recognition. It was the voice of someone they had been taught to obey, even if they pretended she no longer mattered. She slowly placed her hands on the sled's sides, her eyes glowing faintly. The wind shifted, the ocean roared louder, and the sky seemed to hold its breath. Ethan could feel something building, not just in the air, but deep in the earth beneath their feet. The Imperial soldiers, trained and disciplined, hesitated for the first time. Their leader's voice faltered for a brief second. "My lady, you cannot." But she didn't respond. Her gaze was fixed entirely on the sea. In that moment, Ethan realized that this was no longer his journey alone. He had carried her this far, but now the ocean would answer her, and whatever came next would change everything. She stood up. The wind howled across the cliffs as the Imperial soldiers surrounded the sled. The ocean behind them roared with growing force, as if the sea itself sensed what was about to happen. Ethan stood firm between the soldiers and Liora, his boots pressed against the smooth stone platform, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. He wasn't trained for moments like this. He had never faced a squad of armed Imperial soldiers before, yet something inside him refused to move. It wasn't courage born from skill. It was a promise made in the middle of a storm, a promise to a silent girl who had looked at the sea like it was her destiny. The leader of the soldiers raised his hand and signaled his men to hold their position. His face was calm, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. He could see that Ethan was just a human worker, unarmed and ordinary. Yet he couldn't ignore the presence of the girl behind him. She wasn't acting like a fragile royal hidden away in shame. She was sitting upright, her hands resting on the sled, her gaze fixed on the vast ocean ahead. Her violet eyes glowed faintly, and the air around her shimmered in the sunlight. "Move aside, human," the leader said in a controlled voice. "You do not understand the weight of what you are interfering with." Ethan's fists clenched. His voice steady, though his blood was rushing through his veins. "Maybe I don't understand everything," he said, "but I understand this. She's not going back without seeing the ocean." The soldiers shifted uneasily. The ocean's spray hit their armor, and the ground beneath their boots vibrated with the pounding rhythm of the waves. Then it happened. Liora's hands gripped the edges of the sled. Her fingers pressed into the metal as a faint hum filled the air. The glow around her body brightened. The ocean's rhythm seemed to sync with her heartbeat. The soldiers noticed it too, raising their weapons slightly, uncertain whether to prepare for an attack or step back. Ethan turned his head just enough to see her face, and what he saw made his breath catch. Her eyes were no longer just glowing softly. They were burning. Deep violet light swirling like galaxies trapped inside. Slowly, deliberately, she placed her hands on her knees. Her metallic leg bands began to vibrate, emitting a soft ringing sound that echoed across the cliff like ancient bells. Her breathing deepened. The glow spread through her arms and chest, and then moved downward, tracing glowing lines along the metal bands. The soldiers stared, some stepping back unconsciously. Their leader's voice broke through their confusion. "Restrain her," he ordered sharply, but before any of them could move, Liora closed her eyes and exhaled slowly, and then, in one powerful motion, she rose. The straps that held her on the sled loosened as if obeying her will. Her legs trembled for a heartbeat, then locked firmly beneath her, glowing symbols spreading like veins of light across the ground where her feet touched. The sound of the ocean grew deafening, as if every wave was celebrating this moment. Ethan stumbled back a step, his eyes wide with disbelief and awe. He had always believed there was something more inside her, but witnessing it unfold before his eyes was like watching the birth of a legend. Liora stood tall on her own legs for the first time since anyone had ever seen her. Her cloak blew behind her like the wings of some ancient being. Her face was calm, her eyes focused not on the soldiers, not on Ethan, but on the endless horizon. The imperial soldiers froze in shock. Their discipline cracked as they whispered among themselves. "It's not possible," one muttered. "The seal," another gasped. Their leader's face hardened, but there was a flicker of fear in his eyes. "This was never supposed to happen," he whispered under his breath. He raised his hand again to command, but before he could speak, the ground trembled beneath them. A wave surged against the cliffs, sending a massive spray of water into the air. Drenching everyone, the sea had answered. Liora stepped forward, each movement sending ripples through the stone like invisible waves. Her glowing footprints marked the path behind her. She spoke in her language, her voice carrying over the roar of the ocean. The soldiers' translator devices struggled to keep up. The words that did translate came through as, "The tide has returned." Her voice was no longer fragile. It was powerful, steady, and filled with something that made even trained warriors hesitate. The soldiers raised their weapons again, but their hands trembled. They weren't facing a powerless girl anymore. They were standing before the true heir of a forgotten legacy. Ethan watched as the energy around her continued to grow, swirling like storm winds. It didn't feel chaotic. It felt natural, as if the world itself had been waiting for this exact moment. The leader of the soldiers finally shouted, "Stand down," his voice echoing with a mix of authority and fear. But it was too late to control the tide he had come to suppress. Liora lifted her hands slightly, and the ocean responded. Waves rose higher, their crests sparkling with light that matched the glow in her eyes. The air was charged, heavy with ancient power and destiny. Ethan found himself standing at her side, no longer as her protector, but as her witness. He understood now that everything, the journey, the storms, the silent nights, the strange whispers, had been leading to this. She wasn't just breaking physical chains. She was shattering a history written for her. The soldiers could no longer deny what stood before them. For the first time, Liora turned her gaze toward them, and when she spoke, even the wind seemed to stop. Her voice cut through the air like lightning. "You will not take me back," she said. Her language was translated instantly. But the meaning didn't need technology. It was clear in every breath she took. The soldiers, once proud and unshakable, found themselves stepping back. Their leader hesitated, lowering his weapon slowly, not because of orders, but because deep inside, they all recognized what they were seeing. The paralyzed girl who had been hidden away, controlled and silenced, had stood up, and in doing so, she had shaken the foundation of the Empire's control. Ethan stood in silence beside her, the ocean roaring like a choir behind them. He realized that from this moment on, nothing would ever be the same again. A new tide, the air around the cliffs pulsed with a strange, living energy. It felt as if the ocean, the sky, and the very stones beneath their feet were breathing together in rhythm with Liora's heartbeat. The soldiers stood frozen, their weapons lowered but their eyes wide. Some whispered to each other in disbelief, others simply stared, unable to comprehend the transformation that had taken place before their eyes. A girl they had once dismissed as a paralyzed royal burden now stood tall with glowing symbols running down her legs and waves rising behind her like walls of living light. Ethan remained by her side, his chest tight with awe and a strange sense of pride. He had carried her across barren lands, through wind and danger, never expecting that this journey would bring them to something greater than either of them had imagined. The promise he made under a storm had led him to witness history being rewritten in real time. Liora's presence on the cliff was no longer fragile or silent. She stood like a beacon, her cloak billowing in the sea wind. Her hair whipped back as the sky darkened slightly, responding to the power gathering around her. The imperial leader finally stepped forward, his voice trembling though he tried to mask it with formality. "Your Highness," he said slowly, "you were never meant to return like this. The seals were placed for the safety of the Empire. The Council decided—" His words were cut off when Liora raised her hand, not in anger, but in finality. Her voice carried across the cliff like a clear bell. "The Council decided for themselves," she said in her language, the translator echoing each word for everyone to hear. "They decided to hide me, to silence me, to keep the tides asleep. But the ocean does not sleep forever." Her words carried the weight of centuries. The soldiers shifted nervously, understanding that the one standing before them wasn't simply a forgotten royal. She was the true voice of their ancient legacy. Ethan could feel the energy around her building again. Not violent, but powerful and steady, like a rising tide that nothing could hold back. Liora turned slowly toward the ocean, lifting both arms, and the waves responded instantly. They rose higher, forming a colossal arc of glowing water that hung above the cliff without falling, droplets shimmering like stars in the night sky. The soldiers fell to their knees, some crying out in reverence, others simply lowering their heads as if facing a sacred presence. Even their leader, who had stood rigid until now, found himself lowering his weapon and slowly kneeling. The translation device on his chest buzzed softly as he whispered, "The Tidebearer has returned." Ethan didn't understand the phrase completely, but he felt its meaning in the way the soldiers' voices shook when they said it. It was as if an ancient prophecy was unfolding before their eyes. Liora turned back toward them, her glowing eyes meeting theirs. "I am not your prisoner," she said, her voice strong but not cruel. "I am not your secret. I am your truth." Her words hit them harder than any weapon could. She walked forward slowly, her bare feet glowing against the stone, every step leaving marks of light that faded like ripples in water. Ethan followed at her side, not as her guardian anymore, but as someone who had shared her path. His presence beside her wasn't commanding, but it mattered, because in this moment, a human had stood beside a forgotten heir and refused to bend to an empire's silence. The imperial ships overhead hovered in silence, their crews watching through their viewports. Messages were no doubt racing across imperial networks, carrying the impossible news that the hidden heir had awakened her power beside a human on a distant ocean cliff. It was no longer a secret they could contain. The galaxy would soon know, and the tide of history would shift with it. Liora raised her hands once more, and the arc of water above the cliff began to lower, not as destruction but as a blessing. The massive wave curved downward gently, washing over the platform in a controlled surge, bathing everyone in cool, glowing water that sparkled as it touched their armor and skin. The soldiers didn't resist. They knelt deeper, bowing their heads as the ocean surrounded them without harm. It was a symbolic act, a moment that declared the return of a power they had tried to bury. Ethan stood amidst the glowing water, staring in wonder as he felt something deep inside him stir. Not fear, but belonging. When the water receded, Liora stood at the center, her cloak soaked but her posture unshaken. Her eyes softened as she turned toward Ethan. For the first time since he met her, a full smile spread across her face, warm and real. "Thank you," she whispered, and though her voice was quiet, it carried more weight than the roar of the ocean. Ethan didn't reply immediately. His throat was tight, and his mind was still trying to grasp the enormity of what he had witnessed. But deep inside, he knew that his choice to carry her toward the sea had changed more than just one life. The imperial leader rose slowly, his expression transformed. The arrogance and distance were gone, replaced by a mixture of respect, fear, and acceptance. He bowed his head deeply, something that imperial soldiers were never known to do. "We will carry your words back to the council," he said. "The tides have awakened, and the stars will remember this day." His soldiers followed his lead, their metallic knees clinking against the wet stone as they lowered themselves fully, acknowledging the authority they had tried to suppress. Ethan watched silently as the imperial ships adjusted their positions overhead, not in a threatening manner but as if awaiting new orders from someone far above. Liora looked up at the sky, her glowing eyes reflecting the sunlight breaking through the clouds. Her journey was far from over, but a new path had begun, not as a hidden girl but as a living symbol. She stepped forward toward the cliff's edge, the wind whipping around her, and raised her arms one last time. The ocean answered with a powerful wave that surged upward but stopped just before touching her. Hanging in the air like a loyal guardian, the entire scene burned itself into the memory of every soul present, a moment that would echo through history as the day the tide rose again. Ethan stood beside her, the human who had refused to let her face the horizon alone, and in that shared silence between human courage and alien destiny, a new story for the galaxy began.